deeply morally wrong with the way that our society makes, buys, sells, and uses all of these consumer products, as well as decrying the broad infrastructure that creates and distributes these consumer goods in the first place, which includes inventors and companies and stores and advertisers. The most strident anti-consumerists tend to portray the cycle of production and consumption that defines our consumerist economy as something deeply grotesque and pathological, sometimes even something akin to a form of slavery. A particularly arch example of this would be the popular YouTube video, The Story of Stuff, that was put out by the Tides Foundation in 2009. It argues that basically every step of modern consumerism is actively and purposefully sinister, that all of our consumer goods are manufactured by horribly exploitive labor practices, that everything we buy is full of toxic chemicals that are slowly killing us, that all public demand for anything is the result of psychological manipulations by corporations, and that most things we buy serve no purpose beyond generating garbage that is destroying the environment.
In the US, we spend 3 to 4 times as many hours shopping as our counterparts in Europe do. So we're in this ridiculous situation where we go to work, maybe 2 jobs even, and we come home and we're exhausted, so we plop down on our new couch and watch TV, and the commercials tell us you suck, so you gotta go to the mall to buy something to feel better, and then you gotta go to work more to pay for the stuff you just bought, so you come home and you're more tired, so you sit down and you watch more TV, and it tells you to go to the mall again, and we're on this crazy work, watch, spend treadmill, and we could just stop.
Now, I don't just want to immediately brush off some of these more specific anti-consumerist critiques. I mean, there is obviously some truth to them. When it comes to environmental concerns in particular, we should always be conscious of the degree that our consumer habits can have real-world consequences, and accordingly, we should always seek to minimize our trash and dispose of things in the correct way. But you know, this is also an example of a realm in which the uncontested popularity of anti-consumerist rhetoric has made us kind of overly credulous and shallow in our pessimism. Because even though you don't hear that much about it, our consumer culture has actually been getting progressively more and more environmentally responsible in recent years, driven by changes in both consumer and producer behavior alike. For one, the much demonized corporations that provide us with our consumer goods are about as environmentally conscious as they have ever been for all of human history. In fact, it is pretty much all but impossible these days to visit any corporation's website without getting bombarded with all of the various green initiatives they want you to know about. But of course, by and large, we don't want to know about it. The conventional wisdom in American culture is just that the corporations are screwing the environment, and most of us don't bother to look into the facts beyond that, other than maybe sharing the occasional sensational headline that reinforces the sort of pessimism that our culture celebrates. But in reality, there are plenty of positive trend lines out there. Like, did you know that many of the largest corporations in America, including Walmart, Target, and General Mills, have all signed a pact committing to exclusively using plastic packaging that is reusable, recyclable, or compostable as early as next year. According to the most recent numbers from 2022, they have nearly passed the 50% mark. Amazon, meanwhile, is officially in the process of phasing out the use of their plastic delivery bags, which they have already done in Europe. Most of the biggest consumer good companies are also just using far less plastic in their packaging overall these days than they used to, thanks in part to innovations in plastic technology. Unilever, for instance, claims to have cut their plastic use by 1/5 over the last decade by using lighter packages. Starbucks cups, meanwhile, have cut plastic use by up to 20%, while the plastic used to make McDonald's Happy Meal toys is now nearly 50% recycled. So, what is our reaction to hearing stuff like this? Is it to feel optimistic and encouraged that the major consumer goods producers are taking their responsibilities to the planet seriously? Or is it just to assume that this must be some giant greenwashing scam and that everyone involved must be lying and disingenuous and all the rest of it. Which video do you think would get more clicks? Now, in my opinion, the even more pernicious anti-consumerist narrative is the one that simply posits that the lifestyle of the average American consumer is something inherently pointless, oppressive, and pathetic. You know, this idea that if you like to shop, and if you like to own things, and if you derive any part of your personal identity from consumer goods, you are this fundamentally weak and simple-minded person deserving of revulsion, contempt, and pity. And there are a lot of powerful narratives about this flowing from both the cultural left and the cultural right. The cultural left, especially the far left, doesn't like anything that valorizes capitalism, which any sort of overt appreciation of consumer goods obviously does, since the capitalist supply and demand system is what produces all of these goods in the first place. People who appreciate consumerism justify the survival of capitalism. And of course, if you are somebody invested in a political project of making capitalism look horrible, we can't have that. The cultural right, meanwhile, has become increasingly bossy and sanctimonious, insisting that if you don't live one very particular, old-fashioned, traditional lifestyle, you are a disgusting, wimpy, beta cuck. You shouldn't enjoy clothes or toys or snacks or electronics because liking anything other than making a lot of babies with your heterosexual trad spouse is seen as a sign of a decadent, failing West. Similarly, as the right comes to steal more and more anti-science hysteria from the left, they are becoming the faction most likely to wail about how all of the popular consumer products are full of scary toxins that will steal your vril and give you a weak chin. Ideologues on both sides are also very fond of arguments positing that a happy consumer is actually a spiritually empty husk of a human being who only turns to material things to fill a void that is supposed to be filled with a love of Jesus or trees or yoga or whatever. My rebuttal, however, is that it is actually pretty difficult and rare to sustain any sort of spiritual movement that doesn't include at least some element of materialism. I would even say that buying and owning things inevitably comes to play a prominent role in just about any spiritual or philosophical movement that hangs around long enough. People then often scorn this as evidence that a movement is selling out or becoming commercialized. But to me, it signals that we humans are just naturally drawn to obtaining and owning things at some fundamental level, making it difficult for us to experience sincere love or enjoyment for anything without expressing at least some of that love materially. I grew up in a community with a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses, and of all of their weird beliefs, the one that consistently weirded out outsiders the most was their dogmatic refusal to give presents on birthdays or Christmas. Something about that just instinctively feels wrong, and even somewhat anti-human. And I don't think it's because we've just all been brainwashed by the shopping industrial complex. Religious movements that attempt to adopt a strict anti-materialist position tend to get a lot of favorable press in American culture because they are helpful as good examples to shame the rest of us. But in reality, I think they're just preaching yet another form of pious abstention from a natural instinct that winds up being every bit as oppressive and unsatisfying as the thing it is supposed to be offering liberation from. And indeed, in much the same way that spiritual admonitions to abstain from types of sex or food often wind up producing a heavy psychological burden of guilt and humiliation on those who fail to live up to the unnatural demand, so too do those calling for anti-consumerist abstinence often spiral into a kind of self-righteous misery as they attempt to practice what they preach. Even just anecdotally, here on YouTube, I often feel like the most stereotypically jolly YouTuber is one of these chubby, middle-aged guys who likes collecting things, while the most stereotypically miserable YouTuber is a stridently anti-capitalist video essay person who probably spends a lot of time trying to come up with anti-capitalist rationalizations for why he enjoys movies and video games produced by the market economy. And this is what brings me back to the